very good friend here, the Ambassador Laura de Rosario, who is the president of Miriam College and founder of the Institute of the Global Affairs and Diplomacy. Ma'am Lola, for your opening
Okay.
remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tabunda. Dr. Tabunda and I go a long way. We worked together in the establishment of the ASEAN Center in his own university at the New Era University, and I even gave courses there on globalization. We're happy that we're going to focus on the European Union this afternoon. And as I was telling our guest speakers before we went on live, I told them that Filipinos in general are not very much aware of the European Union as an entity and how it works. And it's because for us, we are too in a way, too focused on the US, and then later we became too focused on China. And in between, we were taking care of our own ASEAN relations. But in a way, to me, the reason why I welcome this discussion is that we know that the European Union does play a role, in global affairs, and it's about time really that the European Union should also pay attention to what's happening in Asia. Just as the US finally pivoted to Asia, we waited for a long time for the US to pay attention, to put its focus back on Asia. It was too distracted by the Middle East, too many events happening there, and we felt that as though we were left, the Southeast Asian region, we were left under under the influence of the big power in the region, namely China. So with this diplomatic hour focusing on the European Union, of course, and its own involvement in the Indo-Pacific, I welcome all our speakers wholeheartedly, and thank you guys and Our Lady, with Fanny. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. I welcome our students from other universities, and all those who are in our network. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Lola. It's great to see you again. Actually, we first met when Ma'am Lola was still the Undersecretary of the Office of International Relations, the DFA, and I was with the Development Academy of the Philippines, and I see some participants coming here from the Development Academy of the Philippines. So thank you very much. Welcome again to the Diplomatic Hour. This is an undertaking of the Miriam College Department of Global Affairs and Diplomacy, a unit that was launched 3 years ago, and it specializes in political economy and humanitarian diplomacy. The Diplomatic Hour is part of the department's efforts to bolster its profile as well as to contribute to enhancing policy discourses in the Philippines and the region. For today's episode, we will discuss the EU's Global Gateway Initiative for Southeast Asia and the Philippines. The Global Gateway of Europe offers to build more resilient connections with the world through investments and partnerships. With an investment totaling 300 billion euros from 2021 to 2027, it focuses on 5 priority areas, namely digital networks and infrastructures, climate resilience and clean energy, green, smart, and safe transport, health systems and supply chains, and high-quality education and research. The Global Gateway follows 6 key guiding principles for its investments. These are, number 1, democratic values and high standards. Number 2, good governance and transparency. Number 3, equal partnerships. Number 4, clean and green infrastructures. Number 5, it is security focused. And number 6, it catalyzes private sector investments. To help us shed light on our topic for today, we have lined up 3 very distinguished speakers who will explain to us what the Global Gateway is all about and what are its involvements in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines. Okay, our first speaker, we have the only lady in the group, Miss Fanny Sabiñon. I hope I pronounced your name right. Fanny Sabiñon is a research analyst in the Foreign Policy Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. Her current research covers EU connectivity engagement and international partnerships with countries and regions in Asia Pacific, and across the global south. Prior to joining CEPS, Fanny spent around 5 years in East Asia, mostly in South Korea. From 2019 to 2022, in her former Seoul-based position, she worked in global ocean energy project development with a wide array of stakeholders from the public, private, research, and civil society sectors. She holds a bachelor's in economics and management and a master's in management from ESSEC Business School, as well as a Master of Arts in International Cooperation from the Seoul National University Graduate School of International Studies. She wrote her master thesis on marriage migrant women in South Korea and their civil society support. She likes to approach international affairs through the prism of gender and civil society. Her mother tongue is French. She also has an excellent command of English, working proficiency in Korean, and basic proficiency in German, Italian, and Portuguese. Okay, thank you very much. I now give you Miss Fanny Sauvignon.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Tabunda. Yes, I was a bit surprised to have my little biography read for me, but it's very nice. Thank you so much. Good morning from Brussels. Good afternoon, Miriam College. It's a pleasure to be here. I was told to prepare a visual presentation, so that might help my my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Are you all able to see it?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Wonderful, thank you. First, I want to briefly introduce the context of our research at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, in Brussels. I do research in the Global Connectivity Program that belongs to the Foreign Policy Unit, so EU Foreign Policy Research. When we say global connectivity, we mean all the key areas that you listed of the global gateway. And we really look at this intersection between international partnerships from development, as you know them, and the EU's geopolitical aspirations, which are really evolving right now. And we speak of the global gateway as the EU's global connectivity strategy. We have, I would say, a broad Indo-Pacific focus and sectoral scope. So when you listed these key areas of the global gateway, from digitalization to energy to education, etc., this is really where it gets interesting when you have sectoral conversations, and we have experts in each of these fields. So it's really helpful because we have this, in the foreign policy, we have this geopolitical vision of things, and then we have these sectoral experts. We look at all actors playing in the global gateway, not just EU institutions. And we don't just look at the EU, we look at how we can work with all other entities in the world, could be ASEAN, could be at G20 level, etc. Now, I know the global gateway may be a bit confusing from an external standpoint. It is, quite a recent strategy. It's been more than a year that it was announced, and the communication on the global gateway is, translates a very ambitious project. In the words of EU Commission President von der Leyen, it's above all a geopolitical project to position Europe in this competitive international marketplace, while at the same time supporting the strategic autonomy of our partners. And I think the keyword here is competitiveness. At the same time, there's this ambition, there's this full alignment, mandatory alignment with the UN SDGs and Paris Agreement commitments. So there are strong expectations on all those win-win partnerships and synergies for different goals that, may not be associated when you first think about it. And there is this strong reliance on private sector investment and engagement, and that's one of the key principles of the global gateway. So that's a lot of things to live up to. In terms of governance, I think this is great timing, because right now it's taking shape. It was a bit vague until now, but right now the Global Gateway Board had its first meeting in December 2022. And now they're forming this business advisory group in which the European private sector will really see how they can get involved in this new strategy. What is not as clear for me is how civil society will be involved, whether it's European civil society in partner countries, including the Philippines. There will be a dialogue, but in my opinion, it should be, really well structured. Now, the core of this global gateway approach, those who will really deliver the global gateway on the spot will be Team Europe. Team Europe is an approach that was formed during the pandemic to have a common approach to this health crisis and vaccine diplomacy. It includes EU institutions, but also all EU member states, the agencies, their finance institutions, as well as European banks, such as the European Investment Bank. So this Team Europe approach is to pool resources and expertise under the Team Europe label. There is some enthusiasm from the member states, so that's a positive note. And there are more than 150 Team Europe initiatives, or TEI, that are in development into targeting the entire world. Okay, now looking at the global gateway in the Asian context, you have to look back at the September 2021 EU Indo-Pacific strategy with a lot of priority areas, including the free and open Indo-Pacific. This, which is inspired by Japan. These connectivity partnerships, which are actual flexible agreements with India and Japan, are very important to the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. At the same time, there is a will and a strategy to not antagonize China, although its influence cannot be understated in the region. And when it comes to ASEAN in this strategy, it's mostly mentioned for trade links. A few months later, the EU Global Gateway strategy was announced. And since then, a lot has happened. A lot has happened in Europe. And at the same time, in Asia, and it's not over, economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is, as you said, it's your own prime interest, prime crisis that you have to worry about. And at the same time, the EU was also waiting on its international partners to speak up about Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So we have a lot of these global crises and these diverging priorities. We were finally looking at the Indo-Pacific, and now our eyes were back on Europe. But at the same time, despite these diverging concerns and interests, the regional stakes are very high, and both the ASEAN and the EU, have the opportunity. They need each other in the sense that the ASEAN looks to diversify its partners, and the EU really wants to also play an important part in ASEAN connectivity. And celebrating this 45th anniversary of ASEAN-EU diplomatic relations in December 2022, there was a 10 billion euros package for the global gateway in ASEAN that was announced. But it's not really about the amount of money. This time, I would say that's important to look at. It's how it's going to be spent. There are a lot of elements to this global gateway strategy in ASEAN, among which two key Team Europe initiatives, the Green Team Europe initiative, covering the green transition in all its aspects, and something more recent, the Team Europe initiative on sustainable connectivity. And this time, this one focuses on energy, transport, trades, but also higher education, digitalization, and as part of digitalization, submarine connections. So this is quite important from a maritime affairs point of view. There are also at, I would say, more G7 cooperation level, those just energy transition partnerships with Indonesia and Vietnam. And at regional level and country level, some progress towards cooperation with Japan. Now, zooming in on the Philippines, I would say there is a common conception that there's a potential for much closer partnership, and by the EU on account of the Philippines' growing population, geostrategic location, and relatively stable macroeconomic management. Already in 2020, Team Europe was the Philippines' second ODA donor, after Japan, of course, and Japan's involvement is still much larger. We can expect free trade agreement negotiations to resume, hopefully by the end of 2023. At least that's the goal. And things resumed with Thailand a few days ago, so it's on good track. And quite importantly, the Philippines has an important part to play in the Global Gateway strategy and its communication. Very recently, the EU announced its 2023 flagship Global Gateway projects. That these are projects that the EU wants to highlight due to their strategic importance for the EU. And one of them is Copernicus Digital Philippines Team Europe initiative. And not every country in Southeast Asia has a flagship project for the Global Gateway. By the way, this Team Europe initiative is spearheaded in terms of member states by France, but also Spain, which I think is noteworthy. So Copernicus is actually the EU's Earth observation program. And the plan here is to develop a sort of mirror site, a repository for satellite data, the first one in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. So when you look at the key features of the Global Gateway in the Philippines, there's this focus on the twin transitions, green and digital, including green recovery. But really the strategic highlight is on digital and this national Copernicus mirror sites, which has multiple sectoral applications. So you have climate and disaster resilience, but also food security, environmental protection. And at the same time, you cannot ignore that there are geopolitical implications, because when you have this much satellite data on the Indo-Pacific, that says something about what the EU can do in the Indo-Pacific. There is also a strong people-to-people component to the Global Gateway in the Philippines. And I would say research and innovation is something to look at, especially for a university. Another important element, in my opinion, is that there is high potential for cooperation with like-minded Japan in the Philippines, including on disaster resilience, sustainable urbanization, and more. Okay, so going forward, I see a couple challenges. For example, is the Global Gateway a competitive offer, for the Philippines, which has strong involvement with the US, although there is a focus on military and defense cooperation. There is also, of course, high investment from China, for example, in renewable energy. So the EU gives this offer that's based on all this, sustainability and humanitarian principles. Is it competitive in the eyes of our partners? At the same time, we live in this so-called multipolar world, especially in the Indo-Pacific. But when it comes to connectivity and sectoral cooperation, if you don't work together, this might have negative impacts, on the environment, on the people, on human security. So how do we work not only with Japan or our friends, but also, with countries like China and different development models? Lastly, I think I am curious to see how the private sector is going to behave and engage with this Global Gateway, and how accountability is going to be ensured for civil society, including local communities. Thank you very much. I welcome the following discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fanny. We will entertain questions after all the three speakers have delivered their piece. Next, we have Monsieur Eric Frecon, who is now based in Singapore and is a visiting academic within the University Brunei Darussalam, where he teaches at the Defense Academy and is an adjunct fellow at IRASEC, Research Institute on Contemporary Southeast Asia, based in Bangkok, also Institute for Strategic Research based in Paris, and at the French Naval Academy Sorbonne since 2018. He was a lecturer at the Singapore University of Social Sciences from 2019 to 2020 and the French Naval Academy in 2012 to 2018. This latter position gave him the opportunity to embark on Mistral-class ships in 2015 to 2017 to brief midships on board across Suez Canal, Bab el Mandeb, as well as the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits. Wow, with a stopover in Andaman Islands. He also worked as a research consultant for the Stable Seas project in 2019 to 2020. Previously, he coordinated with the Observatory on Southeast Asia within Asian Center in Paris and was deputy chief editor of the bi-monthly international politics magazine Diplomatie. Beforehand, he served as a research fellow with the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, where he stayed for 3 years. Okay, I now have the pleasure to give you Monsieur Eric Frecon. Eric?
Thank you very much. I try to share my slide. It's okay? You get it?
Yes, we can see it. We can see it.
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and so happy to listen to my colleagues and my eminent colleagues. So I will be just a transition between both of them, because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, but just to share some food for thought. And I won't be that much inventive, so I will use this SWOT analysis as a kind of assessment of the Global Gateway project. So to go straight to the point, first as a kind of introduction, but to keep in mind indeed the context and indeed some idea about the possible opportunities for the Global Gateway project. Indeed, it's a favorable momentum, I would say, if you consider the rival. First, China and its BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. I don't want to go further into the discussion about debt trap or not in Colombo, in Laos, Southeast Asia. You saw this report by Chatham House. Is it because of the government, because of China? But for sure, if you check the promises and the money that the government got at the end of the day, there is a gap. I saw this kind of statistic for Indonesia, for example. And I refer to this work by our friends Alvin Kamba, Francis Hutchinson in Philippines and Malaysia about port development and mine industry, you know, saying that it's not that smooth for China to set up the project because of the local actors, sometimes some local impediments that we have to take into account. And that's why right now we have some backlashes or edging 2.0, I don't know, but for sure, we saw this article about Philippines and your new president compared to Duterte before 2020 at least, and even in Cambodia saying that it's not that clear whether they choose a side or in the Chinese side, and now it seems they are moving. So that's why for China it's quite a tough time, especially for the BRI, and actually less and less article about this BRI. Some articles saying that it's less flashy, etc. Nowadays. What about the USA? USA, same, and always the same comments, remarks, saying that Washington focus on only military initiatives, CCAT, etc., all these multilateral or CARAT bilateral exercises. And okay, there is this Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity. The word is interesting, but meaning an effort to move to more economic issue. But I saw this paper about Singapore, a bit not reluctant because they are part of it, but they are very careful because they don't want to be entangled in this kind of trade war or reshoring in the supply chain vis-a-vis China. So the Southeast Asian partners are quite careful, let's say. And so in this context, you have the European Union moving slowly but surely from being a geo-economic power to a geopolitical one, 2019. And I don't know, but I had in mind, you know, the Bandung spirit, 1955, this idea of non or multi-alignment now, and which echo what the French governments try to elaborate, this idea of third path, balanced power. We know it's not that clear, and our partners are sometimes a bit lost, but you see the idea. And in this wake, you have now in Europe also the idea of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. So I think it can be quite in tune with ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN mindset. But let's be fair, you have straight, again, talking about this external issue. And again, I take again China, USA, Europe. So China, we cannot avoid the fact that China is there with its history, the geography, it's a close neighbor, so you cannot ignore. Yeah, I like this survey by the Pew Research Center about the civil society, I mean, the public opinion, let's say more exactly, and see favorable views in Singapore for China, 67%, a lot compared to USA and compared to 15 to 20% in Japan or South Korea. As a funny, I mean, if I may say, also all this concern about human rights environment, it's not a priority, a big issue for China, so much easier to deal with them. And China, very good in terms of influence, this is a new word now, or in terms of sharp power to advertise or to promote the project. USA, same, they take into account the comment, remark, and now they try to make it wider or broader with this idea of AUKUS plus or Quad plus with a local power on littoral states, let's say, and they try also to move to non-military issue, for example, on maritime domain awareness. And also you have all these countries who are concerned by the Chinese Strait. So, okay, guys, come with us. And again, USA is very good in terms of soft and hard and so smart power. In this context, EU, as you said just now, stuck with post-COVID and the energy crisis, economic crisis, inflation. The priority is maybe not in ASEAN right now. Ukraine, as you said, hence maybe this year in 2022, where the focus was more on Kiev. And Africa, because of the migration, which is a big issue, France, Germany, and Italy, and any other country. So because of that, indeed, this is are the main threats for the global gateway from an external point of view. If now I move to the more internal issue, so for these two slides, I will focus on ASEAN and EU because they are both sides of this bilateral project. So ASEAN, it's not so clear whether these global gateway projects are that new, because as you said, there was this Green Team Europe initiative, but with a meeting, dialogue already in November 2021. Is ASEAN or Southeast Asia a priority? I check on the flagship project. In Asia Pacific, you have 21 projects. I mean, big and small, but let's say 21 projects. And for Southeast Asia, you have 7 to 8 because Cambodia, not so clear whether it's new or old one. So 7, 8 out of 21, not that much, knowing that in Mongolia, for example, you have 2 projects, same as in Indonesia. So. And the funds, the money, it's 3.33% compared to the total amount. So knowing the demographic, the economic weight of ASEAN, same, it's not that much. Plus ASEAN, sometimes, or the governments, let's say, focus more on the short term because of election, because they don't want to lose the face vis-a-vis the neighbor. So they need something quickly. They need to show a highway, power plant or what to the voters, etc. While the EU is working in the long term, reliable, sustainable project, and education, which is new and very good actually, compared to BRI and other projects. But this is more the long term and green, digital, like in Philippines, we saw with Copernicus and connectivity. But for the local people, I don't know. And same within EU, I saw that there was this concern about maybe it's not a whole of EU approach, a bit fragmented, always the same issue, EU, give me which phone number, Kissinger. So is it the Commission? Is it the state member? Is it the bank? Is it so? This can be even if it's great to put together the NGO, private sectors as well, quite innovative. But maybe our partner can be because of that maybe a bit lost. But let's finish with maybe a more positive, optimistic note. With ASEAN, again, it's just the beginning, even if so 2021, but the real start, the meeting in December 2022, it's quite new. We saw these flagship projects in a document from March 2023, so it's very fresh, it's now. And let's not forget EU and ASEAN, it's an old story with a solid and strong foundation, basement, dialogue partner since 1977. You will correct me if I'm wrong, but strategic partnership in 2020. And in the EU strategy for cooperation in Indo-Pacific, I don't know if it's a good order or what, but I mean the EU strategy for Indo-Pacific, 31 times you have the word ASEAN, and you have a dedicated paragraph on ASEAN centrality. And ASEAN, EU are two regional organizations. So I think it's time to indeed to work together. And just now I was talking about the Pew Research Center survey on the public opinion, but the IC survey published in Singapore, which focus more on the elite opinion maker, etc., policy maker, see in terms of political and strategic influence, EU is improving a lot from 0.8 to 4.9%, while China is decreasing. When you ask them whether ASEAN people have to choose a side, I mean, decreasing from 11 to 6%, meaning they don't want to choose either USA or China. And if you ask them, so, okay, but which third party? EU is the first, and sees a big ahead Japan, because almost 43% and improving compared to Japan, 26.6 and decreasing. So it's a good thing from an ASEAN perspective. And within EU, of course, this is as I said just now about the debt trap, when the EU said that the idea is to limit the risk of debt distress, I like it, in line with the principle of transparency. And we have this anti-fraud office. I mean, it worked when we saw what happened in the parliament, but still it's there. And so the effort for transparency, so maybe our partners should feel better because we know what happened sometime for the project. In terms of aid, EU, let's not forget, because EU, it's not that good, as I said, like in terms of influence or smart power, but this is the first world donor, I mean, in the world in 4 years. And plus you have solid structures, and the European Investment Bank is there since 1958. And I like this idea, I mean, even for me it's a bit new, but of dialogues with this team Europe, and meaning, okay, I give you money, but let's work together compared to other projects. So that's why, just to conclude, because I sent email to the delegation to get some insight from them, but one of the answers was saying, okay, we have expectations to mobilize up to, so all these words were a bit blur, I mean, not that strong, because expectation, mobilize, up to, it's not very clear, but 10 billion euro for cooperation. This, I think it's a lot still, even if I say it's not that much, but in the absolute, it's still a lot, and knowing how EU can be serious and what, so I think let's finish with this maybe more optimistic view. So I hope I was not too long, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eric Frecon. We now have our last speaker. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Jagannath Panda, who is the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. He is also a senior fellow of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in the Netherlands and director for Europe-Asia Research Cooperation at the YCAPS in Japan. Dr. Panda has testified to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission of the US Congress. As a senior expert on Indo-Pacific and China, he leads a book series with Routledge, and is the series editor of its studies on Think Asia. He is the author of a book India-China relations, and China's path to power, party, military, and the politics of state transition. Dr. Panda's recent edited works are Chinese Politics and Foreign Policy under Xi Jinping, Quad Plus and Indo-Pacific, Scaling Indo-Japan Cooperation in Indo-Pacific and Beyond 2025, and the Korean Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific Power Politics, Status, Security at Stake, and co-editor of the Future of Korean Peninsula. Before we proceed with Dr. Panda, I wish to announce first that those who will be asking questions after the third speaker, you may just type in your comments in the chat box, or you may raise your hand. Okay, I now give you Dr. Jagana.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Tabunda, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to some Asian friends along with European friends, and I'm a little jet lagged because I'm traveling in Washington, D.C. Just arrived here late last night, and it's actually middle of the night here in Washington, D.C. It's early morning, 3 o'clock. So I'm a little jet lagged and tired. So if you missed some of my points, please get back to me. And unfortunately, I could not prepare my PowerPoint because of my schedule and other appointments, but I'm happy to answer some of your questions through discussion. I think the first two authors, the first two speakers have already spoken a lot about the Global Gateway Strategy. To be very frank, I moved to Europe a year back, precisely a year back, last March in 2022. And since that time, I'm watching the European politics very closely. Now, my first impression about Global Gateway Strategy are that it is a kind of initiatives which allows Europe to stay connected with both Asia and Indo-Pacific more prominently. And I think when you read the Indo-Pacific document and try to connect it with the EU's Global Gateway Strategy, that's the impression one will get. The second objective, and I think that's the narrative which is being built in Europe, is that how far the Global Gateway can be working as a counter initiative to China's Belt and Road initiatives, and how far it could actually collaborate with other specific initiatives in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think these are the two broad narratives that the European communities are trying to build through the Global Gateway Strategy. Now, if you see the Global Gateway Strategy, as both the previous speakers pointed out, it's a 3 billion euro investment strategy between 300 billion euro investment strategy between 2021 to 2027. Now, my first observation about this Global Gateway Strategy is that if you observe very closely, in fact, I have written a series of articles when the Global Gateway Strategy was released, and series of articles in the national interest, which is being published from the Washington, D.C. You can just Google and read my articles. It is a 4-part series article I have published. One is on about how much the Global Gateway can counter China. The second one is how the Global Gateway connect with Indo-Pacific regions, including Japan. Then the third one is how it can connect more prominently with India. And the fourth one is how it can connect more closely with ASEAN. And so the broader narrative about the Global Gateway Strategy is being concentrated between China and the rest of the three prominent Asian blocks of powers, that is Japan, India, and ASEAN. And within that, the Global Gateway Strategy is talking about hard and soft infrastructure. It is talking about digital, climate, energy, transport, health, education, research sectors. So these are promising areas. There are 6, as Fani rightly pointed out, there are 6 sectors. So through this, a kind of engagement process is being built between EU and the rest of the Asian and Indo-Pacific community. But I think some of its core areas equally, even though it is officially very clarified in the documents, and I encourage all the students to read it thoroughly. I think we need to deconstruct some of these issues that has been discussed, and therefore we'll get a lot of clarity. My first objection to the Global Gateway strategy is that it talks about equal partnerships. Now, let's be very honest about this. In a business world, the business transactions might happen on an equal footing, on a face-to-face, on a bilateral mode, but there is nothing called equal partnerships. In a business dealing, there is always a rich person doing the business with a poor person, or a rich company doing a business with a lesser competent company. Even though there are competent equal stakeholders are there, one wins and one loses in the business, or one makes more profit and the other one makes less profit. So there is nothing called equal partnerships. What we have is a kind of more engaging process to create a win-win situation. And this is what the Chinese have been doing through the Belt and Road initiatives. They have been promising the equal partnerships, but they are actually dominating. So the expectations from the EU's Global Gateway strategy would be that how it can promise not to create those debt-trapped scenarios that China's Belt and Road initiatives are actually creating. So therefore, equal partnerships should not be on a face value. Equal partnerships should be on the transaction level, particularly on the business level, aid, donations, investment strategies, while creating a win-win conditions that the Chinese has been talking, but they are actually making the smaller economies debt trap. I think the second aspect that needs to be, challenged about and probably more critically analyzed about the Global Gateway strategy is it's talking about competitiveness, but at the same time, it doesn't really talking about an integrated model. And I think that is one of the significant aspects that we should be talking about. When we're talking about infrastructure, connectivity, and some of these, sustainable developmental issues, it is equally very important to talk about how integrated these issues could be between the regions or between the countries. And I think the whole idea is all about that. Today, when China is actually flooding the Belt and Road Initiatives money or the financial transactions through the Belt and Road Initiatives, they are talking about how China can become the center of global politics, integrating with the world community through business models, or through investment, connectivity, or infrastructure building. I think the similar approach should be seen on the part of EU. And EU's connectivity and infrastructural development plan should have a much more integrated and synergy-oriented collaborations with the Indo-Pacific countries or with the Asian countries. Third, I think it is also important to see from the European Global Gateway strategy or EU's global gateway strategy point of view, that whether EU is really talking about a more Asia-oriented engagement or an Indo-Pacific oriented engagement. And I think there has to be some clarity about that. I was talking to Brussels, as Fanny mentioned, I was there last week in Brussels. I was talking to a few officials, including visiting the European Union Parliament. And for last 1 year, I have been talking about on a range of issues. I think today, what we are seeing that EU is probably having a lot of clarity about its engagement in the Indo-Pacific regions. But at the same time, what EU is actually having a contradiction in its approach is that EU is having a contradiction between an engagement with the Asian powers along with an engagement with the Indo-Pacific powers. Now, this contradiction is not so much about their thinking process, but it's more about the policy level engagement. Now, if you are talking about countries like Japan and India or ASEAN, they are the essential component of Asian economy. and ASEAN scenario. And we know for a fact that there is ASEM, ASEAN, Asia-Europe meeting, ASEM is there. And all this while, before actually you talked about Indo-Pacific, you was actually talking about more Asia-oriented engagement. And within that Asia-oriented engagement, you was actually very single-minded about its engagement with China. So today there is a lot of focus is visible on EU's engagement with Japan, with ASEAN, and with India. And these are the three priority countries. But then EU is structurally having this contradiction or a contradictory engagement policy. Whether these three countries or blocks or powers does figure in EU's Asia policy or in the Indo-Pacific policy that the EU is talking about today. I think that narrative has to be cleared out, because if they are talking about EU's Asia engagement, then it has to be much more bilateral. If it is talking about EU's Indo-Pacific, then it has to be much more integrated and it has to be much more, multilateral in nature. And there, I think a little bit contradiction is visible in EU's approach. And this is what I was talking to some stakeholders, with whom I am currently working on. Now, what are the contradictions? Let me point out some of these initiatives, because this brings my expertise, what I have been writing for last 1.5 to 2 decades. If you talk about Japan, Japan is a critical actor in EU's foreign policy approach. And probably today, Japan has emerged the most important and preferential partner in EU's foreign policy today when it comes to Asia or Indo-Pacific. And in Japan, if we recall, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the PQI strategy, that is the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. In 2016, Shinzo Abe actually revitalized that, calling it EPQI, Expanded Partnership of Quality Infrastructure. Now, there is a lot of talk about how Japan could actually collaborate with the EU's Global Gateway Strategy, but we have not seen any structural engagement happening there. Similarly, about India, India has so many small initiatives, because here we are talking about India as an emerging economy. So India does not have grand initiatives per se. What India has, a grand vision India has. For example, Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. Sagar initiatives that Prime Minister Modi talked about in ASEAN meetings and in Indonesia and few other ASEAN countries. But India has Act East policy. India has a structural engagement with ASEAN. India has Act West policy. India has Connect Central Asia policy. And all of these policies are disjointed. EU's Global Gateway strategies should talk to India about how to collaborate with these initiatives. Third, I think when we're talking about EU's connecting with Indo-Pacific or EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, there is a lot of talk about two initiatives in recent past. One is the G7's initiative about Build Back Better World, the B3W initiatives. And I think that is a critical initiative that EU's Global Gateway strategy should be talking about how to engage with that. And currently, probably there is not much headway has been made when it comes to EU's Global Gateway strategy and the B3W initiatives that US and the G7 countries are talking about. There is one more initiative, which is the Blue Dot Network. The whole idea behind the Blue Dot Network was to question China's Belt and Road initiatives and to question China's transparent initiatives. How the Chinese initiatives of the Belt and Road Initiative, be it SRAB, the Silk Road Economic Belt, or the Maritime Silk Road, they were not really transparent in nature. So the Blue Dot Network was introduced between Japan, Australia, and US to bring out the transparent issue to the core, so that the bids and the infrastructure investment policies will be publicly advertised. It will be developed by both public and private partnerships with the collaboration of public and private partnerships, so that countries can apply and get the projects. So today what's happening, Blue Dot Network within Indo-Pacific has not made much progress, even though within Australia, Japan and the US, there are a lot of progress has happened, but whether Blue Dot Network can bring India, ASEAN countries, including countries like Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, into its fold has not yet been discussed. So in that context, it also makes sense the EU's global gateway strategy, whether it can be a partnering model or the initiatives with the Blue Dot Network, that needs to be explored. I have written about this in a couple of pieces. Now, therefore, I'll conclude by saying that there are 4 or 5 structural challenges with EU's global gateway strategy. One is how to build an equal partnerships. That has to be clarified, debated, and probably, check out in terms of policy discussion more. Second, how to build a more integrated and coherent strategy, which will complement EU's global gateway strategy with EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. And eventually, it will not really create that contradiction that I am talking about between Asia and Indo-Pacific, because EU has to really make its choices, strategic choices, very clear. Third, I think the whole episode of the current geopolitics, the Ukraine war and the Russia war, has created a kind of more strategic synergy between Europe and Indo-Pacific. But then, whether the kind of casualties, the destruction we saw in Ukraine, whether EU's global gateway strategy could really come into rescue of Ukraine, and if in future crisis like this happens, wars like this happens, for example in South China Sea, in Taiwan Strait, in Cross-Strait Strait, to what extent the EU's global gateway strategy can contribute to these crisis-prone areas or to the regions. There a clarity needed. Fourth, I think EU's global gateway strategy needs to have much more clarity and much more precision of its policy decisions, how to reach to the countries in the ASEAN regions as well as in India and Japan, whether there can be a minus China synergy can be built both in Asia and Indo-Pacific, and the contradiction I talked about, whether that can be tackled. Last point, I think the global gateway strategy needs to have also more clarity about whether it is a counter initiative to China's Belt and Road initiatives, or it is looking at the gray areas that the Belt and Road initiatives where it has been questioned, and the global gateway strategy is going to fill that gap. And I think it is important to have that clarity in order, because China's Belt and Road initiatives figures, we don't know the exact amount, but it figures from trillion to 8 trillion, investment economy through the Belt and Road initiatives. But in the global gateway strategy, we are talking about 300 billion, euro investment strategy. So it is important to have synergies with, competing initiatives in the regions from Japan, from ASEAN, from India, and the Indo-Pacific countries like BDN's initiatives and all. So can the EU's global gateway strategy build that global narrative to have EU plus Indo-Pacific synergy that is required to sideline China's Belt and Road initiative? I think that is the point of clarity we need to see in times to come. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to have your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jagannath. No one would suspect that you are suffering from jet lag. Okay, so we now open the floor for questions coming from our participants. You may type your questions here at the chat box, or you may want to raise your hand if you wish to. Okay, we now have the first question. Okay, this one is coming from Dr. Ravena. Jed, I think you may speak personally instead of writing in the chat box. Dr. Jed, Dr. Ravena, what's your question?
Okay, all right, sir. Again, many thanks to Ms. Fanny, Dr. Eric, Dr. Jagannath. It's great to see you all. Wonderful, very insightful presentations. So my question is this. Is there a trend now of decoupling between China and the EU or Europe because of their political disputes with China, which I think in turn makes engagement with ASEAN more valuable? And in relation to that, is ASEAN figuring more, therefore, in the EU's radar than areas like the Middle East or Africa? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, who wants to answer first? Ms. Sauvignon, since you were the first speaker.
Sure, thank you. Yes, representation is very insightful, and I think we had very complementary approaches. On the EU-China decoupling, I would say, so the first thing about the EU is any change in strategy is slow. That's why it can be frustrating from an outside point of view, from an Indian point of view, etc., to see any long-term change. I would say now there are discussions on first seeing how dependent we are on China, what we are dependent on China for, and how we can move on from this, with this buzzword of friendshoring. And yes, I think definitely ASEAN member nations will be co-partners for this diversification of partnerships. Now on ASEAN figuring on the EU's radar more than the Middle East or Africa, I want to say yes, but no. One thing is half of the Global Gateways engagement is in a way committed to Africa. That's a fact. And in terms of the Middle East, so foreign policy in Europe used to be, I mean, I'm quite young, but a few years ago, we were talking more about neighborhood policies. So Europe's neighborhood in the south, and now Europe's neighborhood in the east, which is also the core of attention right now. There is still EU engagement in the Middle East because it's very important from a security and human security resilience point of view. But that doesn't mean, it's not because half of the global gateway is going to Africa. It doesn't mean the ASEAN is not important. The EU is waking up to the fact that the geopolitical gravity center is in Asia, not in Europe. They will do well not to forget this. And one last thing, I completely agree with Dr. Panda that not enough dialogue, not enough attention is given to India, which is very, very central to any Indo-Pacific strategy.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fanny. Dr. Eric?
Sorry. Yes, no, nothing to add, but it's true that the relationship, I mean, EU-China, it's not easy. Yeah? So that's why we are always, we don't know how to consider, is China a competitor, a systemic rival? This was in 2019, or a partner in terms of climate change. And then, still this morning, I was listening to a discussion about that. So it's very difficult, but it's quite in tune with the ASEAN approach, which is the same. We don't know whether it's how to call it, hedging or whatever, but the key word for both of them is inclusivity. I mean, to be inclusive, not exclusive, meaning still to engage. But then after, it's still very subtle and tricky because we engage, but we maintain some channel, I mean, to be able to talk to each other, but not much, no more than that, just to be able to communicate. So that's why it's very tricky. But at the end of the day, I think EU and ASEAN are equally opaque or not clear regarding China, so they can work on it, trying to be, again, not a third part, not a balanced power, but to offer another option, which doesn't mean equidistance. This was a big trap, I mean, for France. Okay, there is a third path, but it's not equidistant. France definitely is still closer to USA because of history, etc. So that's why, but that said, I'm not so sure. I would love indeed to be EU closer to to ASEAN. I said, indeed, they work for that. I mean, the strategic partnership, the dialogue partner. There is a proper, not embassy, but delegation to ASEAN. I mean, it's not the one in Indonesia for ASEAN. You have one delegation for Indonesia and one delegation for ASEAN. Interestingly, in part of this delegation, you have a army colonel, meaning that defense is also a key issue. But at the end of the day, Africa will be still, I think, the main focus for EU because of migration, etc. And Ukraine also, because we have this Eastern country, I mean, Eastern Europe country concerned by Russia, Eurasia, Ukraine. We have this Mediterranean country concerned by migration from Africa. So I don't know, but still all the tools, everything is there to work closer and closer with ASEAN, definitely. And I think with the same approach vis-a-vis China. I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Eric. Dr. Jagannath, your response to the question.
I think I would more or less agree with both, Ms. Fanny and Mr. Eric. Let me put it this way. I think decoupling is a very complicated topic. It's not going to be easy that the business companies or communities will just withdraw from China or disassociate with the Chinese economy to engage in a decoupling process. Decoupling in a way implies that there is no structural disconnect entirely. There is only a partial disengagement, no structural disconnect, because the Chinese economy is connected with global economy very deeply. China has more international banks than any country today has. So Hong Kong and Shanghai has most of the international leading banks are there, having either headquarters or their branch offices there. Each provinces of China has one of the world's largest bank branch office. Most importantly, some of the Chinese companies and banking sectors, they're highly ranked in the global ranking system. So when it comes to the global finance connect or the global economic connect, China is way deeper than what we could think. And therefore, it allows us to think that how the businesses will be conducted on the ground. The companies, those who are going to operate in China, or they are going to pull out their businesses in China, they has to connect and do their operations through the services sector. And it is not easy to close down those operations because the companies, the various global companies, they will go into crisis. I'll just cite an example from India. If you see the China-India boundary dispute, this is what I did a study with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in India very recently. And I am in their experts advisory group about that. The China-India boundary dispute is actually complicating the China-India relations. The relationship is going down. But on the contrary, if you see, China-India trade and economic engagement is going up. The trade contacts is actually improving. And during the pandemic and during the Galwan incident, if you see, the trade contacts between China and India actually has seen a growth trend. Despite of the boundary disputes and the relationship between the two countries has become very tense and rival-prone. So therefore, when it comes to Europe, let's understand one thing. Like ASEAN, the European communities are also equally divided on China. There are pro-China countries, and there are neutral countries, and there are anti-China countries. So it's not really easy to build a consensus on China as a enemy country or as a adversary country, even though EU on the official line has declared China as a kind of systemic rival, but it's not really easy on the business sector to declare China as a rival economy. And when it comes to the Chinese economy, I think there are many Eastern and Central European countries are there who are very closely linked with the Chinese economy and Chinese investment plan. Even that the 17+1 or the 16+1 have actually come down to 13+1 or 14+1. But I believe we have to wait for more couple of years. Of course, China is now facing the heat and won't, probably because of the weak Ukraine war, because the way they have supported Russia on Ukraine war. But I think the whole Chinese foreign policy strategy all this while has been focused on their economic diplomacy. And economic diplomacy will revitalize only in times to come. And I think now the Chinese, Xi Jinping, after the 20th Party Congress, has got a new team. Now there is a new Chinese premier who is an economist, and there will be a lot of focus on Europe, how to rebuild China's engagement with Europe. And also we should draw inferences how China has actually criticized Putin recently on the Ukraine war. So keeping all of this thing in mind, I can argue and say that decoupling is not entirely a strategic choice for EU. There might be a partial restriction on some of the Chinese companies, some of the Chinese business holders to operate within Europe and to probably put a check and curve on their activities like India is doing, like United States is doing. But decoupling is a big game, very complicated game. I don't see there will be decoupling between China and Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jagannath. We have the next set of questions coming from Aliana Isabel Ortoa. The first question is, with the current crisis of the pandemic, like the Philippines are further than ever in terms of poverty levels for the Agenda's 2030 deadline, how do you anticipate the global initiative in contributing to sustainable development? So given the current pandemic crisis. Second, given the implications of the EU's Global Gateway Initiative for Southeast Asia and the Philippines, it has sustainable variable allocations. What are the possible strategic inclinations to sustain the power of the claimants? What claimants are you referring to here? And with regard to China's Belt and Road Initiative in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, how can Europe's soft power enable it to gain a seat at the table as an honest and trustworthy broker in a crowded Indo-Pacific arena? So the first question is, how do you anticipate the global initiative in contributing to sustainable development given the current pandemic? Okay, so who wants to answer first? Or we go with Jagannath first, Dr. Jagannath.
Okay. Well, there are too many questions, and also it's more about Philippines, and I'm not an expert on Philippines, but let me summarize some of these questions to give my broad answer. What I feel, I think, I'm here in DC just to brief on some of these issues, how the no limit partnership between China and Russia is going to affect India, and how is it going to affect the Indo-Pacific countries, including US and EU. One interesting point I would like to draw your attention, what I'm going to speak here today and tomorrow, is that, look at some of these banks: Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank of the BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Russia-India-China trilaterals. These are big initiatives and big multilateral development banks where the Chinese are operating through their global strategy. Now, one interesting point, there has been a lot of backlash against China. There has been a lot of backlash on China on pandemic issues, and particularly on the issue how China has given a blank support to Russia. But if you see about AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a lot of European countries are members of AIIB. They have not really withdrawn or, decided to withdraw from AIIB. So it explains the fact that Europe still wants to stay connected with AIIB. Let's take the example of New Development Bank of the BRICS. It's basically is a Chinese push, Chinese creation, even though India and many other countries within BRICS support the New Development Bank. but the Chinese dominate and they are the principal economic actor. The global south is very well connected with New Development Bank. Even though the New Development Bank has not really done anything magical, but the similar way we could also question and put a critical views about Asian Development Bank to IMF to World Bank. But given the last few years trajectory, both AIIB and New Development Bank, they have done exceptionally well in terms of flooding the initiatives and the connectivity initiatives in the Eurasian regions. So therefore, one point which we should take into account that smaller and medium ranked economies, they want to stay engaged with Chinese economy, either bilaterally or through multilaterally. And therefore, countries like Philippines, ASEAN countries, they will be forced to, in a way, to stay connected with China, with the Chinese economy, either bilaterally or multilaterally. And there is no escape zone from that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm losing my signal now. Okay, maybe we have Dr. Eric to answer the question. Actually, there's a third question. I want to repeat it. How can Europe's soft power enable it to gain a seat at the table as an honest and trustworthy broker in a crowded Indo-Pacific arena? Okay, Dr. Eric?
Yeah, thank you very much. Not an easy question, but because the first question, indeed, I think the EU diplomat or people in the EU delegation in Manila have the answer, but not me. The second question, I'm not too sure about the claimant, indeed, with South China Sea what, but maybe to answer this third question and together to comment the presentation of Dr. Panda as well, and maybe also to answer I saw there was another question, so to put it together. No, but just to say that actually EU, I mean, the chance for EU is of not being sui generis, being not a state, not a regional organization, being something very specific, and which means compared to, that's why I think there is nothing to do with, I saw in one of the questions, and we talk about that just now also, this idea of debt trap or not, why not from EU, but from China or what. But so, and why EU could be sit on the table because it's already overcrowded. But EU is specific because indeed you don't have this history, this tributary system between China and the regional states. EU is not looking for base or facilities, along these sea lines of communication or what. And EU is not part of ADMM Plus, the ASEAN Defense Minister meetings, and together with a dialogue partner. So it's not looking for, a country to support their view, etc. So I think it can appear more neutral, I would say. I mean, not stuck into this issue, but promoting all this, I mean, concerned by all this issue about climate change, to protect environment, etc. So I think this is an opportunity for EU to bring some fresh insight. I don't know, something new in the discussion. And I had friends indeed they were asked about, but what about EU, for example, in Taiwan, China, or whatever. But let's not forget that EU is a very, very big, let's say big, heavy economic actor. And meaning, on the one hand, it's not a military actor, which can be good as well, but it's not. But it's an economic actor, meaning if it's in time of sanction, of negotiation, threat, I mean, you cannot neglect EU, meaning better to have EU part of the discussion because we are talking about a huge market as well. So for this reason, I think that there is no search for to have a tributary relation or dependence relation with any other country, but yes, to be part of a security discussion in the region. And just maybe one detail, how can EU contribute? I saw there were quickly the question about hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics, etc. EU, I mean, via its program, CRIMARIO, CRIMARIO, I mean, there is this tool in terms of MDA, maritime domain awareness. I'm more familiar with this maritime security issue. And I think this is something which could be very helpful for the Southeast Asian country in terms of maritime security in general.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eric. Ms. Fanny, your response, please.
Yes, and thank you for the questions. I'm going to take the angle of equal partnerships and soft power, because these are questions that I think are very important. And that may not be so well understood in Europe. You know, Europe carries all these values in its international engagement, which is, I think, generally a good thing, you know, human rights, environmental, social governance. All those are important, but there's also this idea that what the Europe puts in place is, you know, universal values. But as someone who has studied international cooperation with East Asians and Africans, it's challenging, you know, and equal partnerships is one of the key principles of the Global Gateway. You know, the other principles, including democratic governance, etc., or green projects, they make sense right away. The challenging ones are this private sector engagement and equal partnerships, because the way that equal partnerships is described right now is we base our projects on the partners' needs, so their own development plans, and we don't try not to trap them with unsustainable debt. But I think the EU needs to go further, because with the Global Gateway, they have the ambition to change the paradigm of how the world sees the EU. And that's very ambitious. And if you want to do that and really want to have equal partnerships, then you need to have these, you know, eye-to-eye partnerships. And it's not self-evident. There's still this notion, you know, as much as they want to say it's not, they still have these notions of developing or developed countries. And it's hard to, you know, these habits die hard. And, you know, not every member state in the EU is engaged in the world in the same way. You also have the weight of history. I'm thinking in particular of, you know, French history in the entire world. You know, there's French territory on every continent on this planet. And, you know, this has a big impact on how the world sees different European countries, and maybe our partners in different continents look at different member states and not necessarily at the EU itself. I am looking forward to how it will take time for this equal partnerships principle to take shape, but I think it's an important one. What can I say? It's the you know, ASEAN, they have their own, you know, economic crisis to worry about, their own connectivity to worry about. And we, as Dr. Panda said earlier, we are building sustainable connections, long-term connections. And I hope that these will make sense eventually. And we actually do need this paradigm change, not because, I mean, the EU's geopolitical gaining in importance, that would be a welcome outcome. But the first benefit would be for us. I think we need this transformational approach to international relations. That's my hope.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fanny. We have the next set of questions coming from Carl. As the strategic competition between the West and China seems to intensify, there are talks about the impending splinternet, the looming divergence of scientific development, and the setting of technological standards, which may force countries to pick sides. What do you think the role of the global gateway policy of the EU will be in ensuring that trade, infrastructure, and technologies will be accessible to developing countries like Southeast Asia? And to continue, there's a deep suspicion amongst some countries that China's checkbook diplomacy might be a debt trap, using Europe's financial using Europe's financial and soft power in this era of growing geoeconomic coercion gray zone operations and hybrid warfare as tools for global domination? What will be the global gateway's role in the international trade system for ASEAN? Moreover, how can the Philippines play a part in it? Okay, who wants to answer first? Dr. Eric?
I mean, I was saying no because not easy. No, but that's what I tried to do in my previous comment because I had seen the question. So I cannot answer in detail, and I think that's what we said previously. I mean, in terms of being this third option, and that's what I was saying also in terms of maritime domain awareness, and because of the gray zone tactics and the security of the sea line of communication, the trade, the supply chain, etc. But no, I think I won't bring any more comment compared to what I said.
Okay, Dr. Jagannath, your take on the questions.
Yeah, so when it comes to technology, one aspect that we need to understand is that technology is becoming an integral part of economic cooperation in today's world. Be it connectivity, be it infrastructure, be it cooperation on trade and economics. I think we are talking about multimodal connectivity. We are talking about sustainable development. We are talking about connectivity with a multi-pronged areas. In every sector, technology plays a role. And to that extent, I think there is a lot of scope between EU's global gateway strategy, EU as a multilateral agency, and ASEAN as a multilateral agency. We know for a fact that it's very difficult to compare which is a successful model, whether EU is a successful model or ASEAN is a successful model. But on the paper, I think if I have to draw a comparison, I would say probably EU is a much more advanced successful model because it has a Eurozone, free movement of scholars, it has a common currency. So in that way, EU is a much more integrated model in comparison to ASEAN in some ways. But I think one of the problem that EU is today having, it does not have a much more coherent and joint strategy on cybersecurity, on digital diplomacy, on e-commerce, on digital connectivity, multimodal digital connectivity. Some of these areas are allowing EU not to have, in fact, a bilateral MTA with India. Of course, India is also finding it difficult to sign with EU. So some of these are gray areas. And I think a lot has to be discussed and clarified before there has to be any kind of specific collaboration between EU and ASEAN countries or EU, ASEAN as an institution. So therefore, I think we have to wait for some more years. The second question was about gray zones and about gray zone operations and other complicated issues in the regions that we are talking about. And I think there probably my answer would be very short and crisp, that when it comes to geo-economic coercion, gray zone operations, hybrid warfare, authoritarian powers has a very convenient way of operating through their foreign policy. Democratic countries do not have that kind of operational skills. And when we are talking about European Union's approach has been much more democratic ways. So I don't think EU can be of a much help to the economic coercions, the coercive diplomacy that the Southeast Asian regions is currently witnessing. What EU can do is actually to create a necessary awareness in terms of international legal standards, rule of law, and questioning most of the things. For example, if we talk about, because we are talking about here with our Philippine students and colleagues, what happened to the permanent court of arbitration's ruling? Nothing has happened. That ruling came, but are we able to curb the Chinese activities in the South China Sea? No, we have not been able to. So therefore, I think there are structural constraints and difficulties are there. So we should not be over ambitious, but I think EU is still a very effective voice globally. European Union, Europe itself has, many international court of just, arbiters, tribunals, and it has an effective parliament. It is a greater voice in the global politics. So therefore, I think what ASEAN countries or some of the ASEAN countries, including Philippines, should strengthen its partnership and collaboration with EU as an institution, as a multilateral agencies, and also particularly with Brussels, because Brussels, the more voices coming from Brussels, that will reflect more effectively in the ASEAN zone, in the ASEAN region, including in Indo-Pacific. So therefore, I think the expectation from EU should be how to have a much more collaborative effort in terms of creating necessary awareness, in terms of creating the legality of the issues, particularly in the South China Sea zones, about questioning China's, economic coercion to, maritime coercion. And I think there a lot has to be done, but I don't think EU as an institution can come into play, including NATO at this moment, to rescue ASEAN or ASEAN countries on the South China Sea dispute.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jagannath. Quick response, Ms. Fanny, before we go to the last question.
Okay, I will try to be quick. And well, I already saw the last question, and I just want to say that the EU might be trying to counter RC, not the entire BRICS. Actually, with the, this year, India has the presidency of the G20. And they are this troika with Indonesia last year and Brazil next year. And together, I think, we should try to safeguard global public goods, and that should include data. The thing is, we all have, this technological standards question. Data is very important, but we all have a different idea of how to manage data. Not just, the West versus the East, but also even, for example, India and the EU. We look at data differently. And I think for the Philippines is very relevant. We mentioned this Copernicus project, which I think, you could take a look at, look up on the internet. The way the EU tries to handle that is by having trade and technology dialogues. There are two formal ones that are established, one with the United States and one with India, actually, which started working quite recently. And those are working groups that work on separate issues on trade and technology. Now, of course, the problem is it will be with the way the different digital infrastructure with China. So, we keep saying we need to work with like-minded partners, and this is very important because, India, Japan, South Korea as well, we work very closely on data governance, but yet we still haven't found a way, to sit at the same table with China. And, there's this perception that is completely, it cannot be reconciled, that, for example, TikTok is the devil and will steal your data. I mean, it's a perception, but it also has been, revealed to be true to some extent. And that is a true challenge. And I think data governance will take some time and some difficult negotiations. But the one thing we have to ensure as fast as possible is that we collaborate at least on climate and disaster resilience, on these big macroeconomic risks that affect absolutely everyone. So I hope we can get together on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Fanny. Actually, we have the last question. She already answered it. Eric, you want to say?
No, very quickly, because I was not that talkative just now, but to answer what our two friends said just now, in terms of influence and to deal with unrestricted warfare from China, or key issue indeed, but just to share with you that now influence has been part of the last French strategic review as a key issue, meaning now we take it into account. So I don't know if there will be follow-up within EU, but in France, it's one major state. And because Global Gateway worked together with civil society, NGO, etc., there was a consortium of journalists which did a great work precisely for investigation against to fight fake news with a company based in Israel, etc. So I think skills are there. So hopefully it could be now at the European level. Regarding South China Sea, because of trade, etc., indeed, Europe is absent, but as you said very kindly in the biography, but I was on board this Mistral class ship when it crossed. I mean, I was just before, but then some EU officer came on board to sail across the South China Sea, and this was just after a key speech by the French MINDEF at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2016, saying EU has to do something. So the EU delegation in Singapore shared with me we were taken by surprise, but at least there was this initiative. And recently you had this E3, Germany, UK, France, not verbal, precisely again to support the 2016 award. So they try to do some stuff. And data is a key issue. I love it indeed. You're right. Just to share with you, in Singapore was also a key concern because of the TikTok data center, the Google data center, etc. And then to ask, we know Singapore, so are you sure you don't share? And then I would say a Singaporean researcher / diplomat said, no, this is a sovereign issue, so we have to monitor this closely, which is quite a good sign. And then just to keep in mind the undersea cable, because data also go through these cables, which is also a key concern.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Dr. Jagannath, answer please quickly the final question. How can the EU counter BRICS' growing influence in the region, which includes Indonesia's recent movement towards BRICS? Quick response.
I think it's not really a choice here that we need to create an ambience where EU has to counter BRICS. I think BRICS mandate is much more global. BRICS mandate is to have a much more global South Connect, and this is what the Chinese are aiming to, create. So therefore, we have to think whether EU's global gateway strategy is looking at those specific issues to counter. Then I think there is it makes a lot of sense to counter the BRICS influence, and possibly to for EU's global gateway, it's possible to have a stronger ties with India so that India will lessen its ties with the BRICS. But without India really pulling out of the BRICS, it's never going to happen that EU is going to counter BRICS, because India is very well connected with Russia and China in the multilateral agencies, because India wants to stay connected as a Eurasian power. And I think that's the contradiction here. So a counter narrative between EU's global gateway strategy with regard to BRICS is not really a prominent one at this moment. What is more important at this moment is how to build a good synergy in terms of effecting an effective partnerships, which will be much more equal between EU's global gateway strategy with the Indo-Pacific countries and Indo-Pacific initiatives, not to engage with a counter narrative in the Eurasian regions with the BRICS, AIIB, and other initiatives.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting and engaging afternoon. I wish we had more time, but actually we're running over time already. So thank you very much for your very insightful discussions on what the Global Gateway is all about. So Global Gateway is this European strategy to boost smart, clean, and secure links in digital, energy, and transport sectors, and to strengthen health, education, and research systems across the world. It is consistent with the European development policy that aims to foster sustainable development and stability in developing countries, with the ultimate goal of eradicating extreme poverty. Development assistance is one of the pillars of the EU's external action alongside foreign, security, and trade policies. But as what Ambassador Rosai said earlier, EU is not really a big part of Philippines' consciousness, even if the country has been colonized by Spain for more than 300 years, since we are too focused on US and China now. So I think it is really high time for EU to pay more attention to what is happening in Asia, as what the US has done in the past several years. And we are confident that the Global Gateway, although it just formed the Global Gateway Initiative here in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines, will be more active. Although, as Fanny said, that the bulk of the Global Gateway facility is really intended for Africa. But I hope that with this Global Gateway, it will raise more consciousness among Southeast Asians, among Philippines, that EU is really a very productive partner here in this part of the world. Okay, but of course we have to address some challenges, as what our three distinguished speakers said earlier. We have to make sure that there is really equal partnership between among the actors here in this program, because there's no such thing in a business dealing where there will always be equal profit for all. So one will win, another one will lose, or one will gain more, another one will gain less. And then also there's a question of how to build a coherent integrated strategy for doing business vis-a-vis the Global Gateway Initiative. And yeah, the issue that really surfaced is this a counter initiative against China, or is just is the Global Gateway just an instrument to address gray areas of China's BIR? I hope any final word coming from our speakers before we end this session. Fanny, any final word?
I think, the Global Gateway's implementation is just still in its beginnings. There are a lot of things being published right now on the official sources, and also wealth of policy debate. So I hope Philippines and ASEAN audience can be interested in this and follow. If you have a preferred sector, something that you really care about, then follow this specific track. Okay,
Eric?
EU has always been a key challenge for students, for observer, political scientists, because it's something very specific. So as expected, yeah, we will have to survey this closely. But just a quick word to thank everybody, Joselle, who was in charge, and also Dr. Aaron, who very kindly took the initiative. So thank you very much, Aaron.
Okay, Dr. Jagannath.
No, thank you very much. And I think this kind of initiatives really allows for a free and frank discussion between, the European scholars and the Asian scholars. So this is a very good initiatives, and we need more such kind of initiatives from ASEAN regions, including from India. But thank you very much, Dr. Tambunda, and also Dr. Aaron Ravena, for this kind invitation, and good to speak to all the students and faculties here.
Okay, once more, thank you very much again to our distinguished speakers, and thank you very much to the organizers of this highly informative and insightful webinar, our Diplomatic Hour. Okay, see you in our next episode of Diplomatic Hour.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Maraming salamat. Merci beaucoup.
Maraming